Welcome, everyone, to the Sciences panel to discuss open publishing and open scholarship in the Big Ten. All right, there we go. I think video is happening. Welcome again to the Sciences panel. Welcome especially to our panelists who are faculty from Big Ten campuses who actively use open channels for their publication and are active in conversations about open publishing and open scholarship. Let's see. In their disciplines and on their campuses, we have Michael Dougherty, who is chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. Sylvie Brodeur, professor of agronomy here at Purdue University. Brian Karstens, chair of the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at The Ohio State University. I hope my Ohio State colleagues noticed that I added the. And then Moin Syed, professor of the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. I'm taking a quick look at the Q&A to see if we're good on the sciences panel. It looks like we are. So I'll go ahead and continue. To start off our discussion, our panelists have prepared short remarks to introduce themselves and to give a thumbnail sketch of their perspective on the topic today. So you get an idea of who's on our panel and why they've been invited. I'll lead off with some opening thoughts and followed by our panelists. So for me, being part of the Big Ten Library Group and our conversations around open scholarship and open science, open access has been invigorating for my career. I have believed for a long time, and I'll use the words of my former colleague at the University of Minnesota, really around the march to open scholarship is inevitable, and it's leading already to fundamental change. I am delighted with the direction we're heading in the Big Ten, really the guiding star around our work to provide collections and access to collections and resources for our campuses around the open knowledge ecosystem. The idea that just, trustworthy, scalable, and sustainable are part of our guiding star as we move forward is, I think, a very important movement. I have not seen that a lot of other places, at least not yet. But having just listed first, and Morris talked about this earlier, I think is crucial to really moving forward in a way that's going to change the model for open scholarship, for scholarship on our campuses, but also change it in a way that's going to matter for the future. We've been concerned about the sustainable nature of scholarship in our field for a long time. Scalable has been increasingly important, trustworthy, but just, when we add just in, we're going to have a whole new opportunity to really have a global impact. And I'm delighted that the Big Ten is leading in that. And I think I'm supposed to tell you that I'm Beth McNeil and I'm the Dean of Libraries at Purdue University. I'll stop there and ask Michael to introduce himself. Michael Dougherty.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Dougherty. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. Over the past 5 years, I've led a fairly substantial reform in our department's policies to more fully incentivize and recognize faculty efforts in open scholarship and open science. We have reformed our hiring process, annual review process, our promotion processes, all to explicitly include open scholarship practices as part of a broader reform effort, all aimed at aligning our incentive structures with our institutional values. Just to give you a little bit more context, we now include open science as part of our review of job applicants. We also include it in our annual review and in our promotion and tenure process. These are sort of formally included now. In addition to these reforms, I've also rolled out a number of other sort of initiatives, including now when I provide startup funds to new faculty member, I include open access publishing funds as part of that, and have been doing that since 2018. We've also rolled out a number of funding initiatives in the department to help or incentivize faculty to develop open resources as part of their research. Over the past 2 years, I've been participating in a number of national initiatives on this topic, as well as leading some faculty or departmental workshops for reforming promotion and tenure criteria. And so I'll just add that if anybody is interested in talking with me about how we were able to do that in our department, I'll put my email into the chat after a bit. Feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk with anybody about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I have a feeling we'll have a lot of questions. Next, I'll turn to Sylvie Brodeur to introduce herself and make some remarks.
Thank you, Beth. So my interest in open actually started with data, and it started about the same time as that graph Maurice showed back in 2000. I have a background in ecology, but my position has always been around agriculture and around the ability to translate the science into practice and make recommendations. I also run a long-term research facility, which generates a lot of data. And back in 2000, I started to explore ways that I could make that data available without me being in the middle. And so naturally, I turned to libraries to do that. I was also interested in being able to acquire data from colleagues. Extension specialists don't always put everything in the peer literature. And so that was where I started. But I became much more engaged in the issue of publication and open publication when I assumed the leadership of my professional societies not too many years ago. Back in 2014, 2015, the decision was made that we would no longer self-publish our rather small array of journals. And we started looking for a collaborator, and we took bids from various publishing entities and ended up going with a private publishing partner. At the same time, we were having a really hard look at our professional society business model and growing really concerned about our sustainability with declining numbers and low impact factors for our journals and all the things that give professional society angst. We also were doing strategic planning, and we wanted to be more international and to add specifically diversity and inclusivity to our strategic plan. So in all of this, my discipline, agriculture, it has not been particularly on the leading edge of open anything. And we are struggling with the role that publication fees pay in our business model, and the tension between the value of exclusivity in a professional society in driving perceptions of impacts, and our desire for inclusivity and to make science more accessible, especially agricultural science, to those that literally cannot afford our professional society. So I will end there. We haven't solved the problem.
Thank you, Sylvie. I'll turn now to Brian Karstens.
Thank you. So my name is Brian Karstens. As Beth mentioned earlier, I am the chair of my department at Ohio State University. Like Sylvie, though, I also have been really active in a professional society. And so the society in question is the Society of Systematic Biologists. We're the type of biologist that does a lot of work with biodiversity. So everything from naming species to understanding how species are related to one another to working with natural history collections. And our society, like a lot of societies, at one point supported itself in terms of revenue based on subscriptions to physical journals. And over the last 20 years, that's of course been upended. And so as part of my work as the editor of our journal, which is published by Oxford University Press, I started working several years ago with the Ohio State Library Publishing Program to start a new journal that would be published via the library. And Our goal here was to support open access publishing and also support researchers who were working in developing countries who have important science to publish, but might not have good venues for the publication of that can be done in an open way. And so currently we just finished our first year of publishing for this new journal, which is called the Bulletin of the Society of Systematic Biologists. We published 10 open access gold papers free of charge to members in the society. And so we're basically subsidizing some of the copy editing and layout types of costs associated with publishing via revenue from other sources in the society.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next, I'll turn to Moin Syed.
Great, thanks, Beth. Hi, everyone. I am Moin Syed. Moin like coin, Syed like psychology educator, as I shared with everyone earlier to know how to pronounce my name. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And just FYI, apparently they're still working on the roof here in Elliott Hall at the University of Minnesota. So if you hear some banging, that's because they're up there replacing our very old roof. First, I actually want to say thank you to all the librarians and those who work in the libraries for all of the work that you do. I was one of those people who was very ignorant about the work of librarians until relatively recently. And now I fully understand the crucial role that you play, especially around open access and open science. I've been pretty active in science reform in general. I see open access as a part of the broader open science movement that's going across psychology, of course, but throughout the sciences, concerning not only accessibility, but also transparency, credibility, reproducibility, and all of those kinds of factors. But most of my efforts have been, in terms of reform, have been on the editorial side of things. So I've served as an editor-in-chief of 2 journals, one published by Sage, one by Wiley, over the past 10 years. And so putting a lot of effort into trying to change policies, procedures, practices, attitudes, both amongst authors and amongst publishers from that EIC role. And I've been involved in 3 relevant initiatives related to publishing. I'm sure all these I'll talk more about during our actual discussion, but one is regarding registered reports, which are a new publishing format that essentially shifts normally, the typical procedure for developing and writing a research article is to conduct the study, write it up with results and all, send it off to get published. Hopefully it doesn't get rejected. Usually it does. You revise it, submit it somewhere else, right? And the evaluation really focuses heavily on the nature of the results. The nature of the findings are what are critically important. Register reports splits up the publishing process so that it's only the introduction method section before the study has been conducted. So before you have any data, before you've conducted analyses, you submit basically a proposal to a journal, and then they accept it or reject it based on that information. So it shifts the evaluation from the nature of the findings to the quality of the design itself. And so you can have a really well done study that gets accepted, and it can have spectacularly null findings, and that's totally fine because the journal has already committed to saying, we want to publish this work because it's meaningful and useful, regardless what the results are, regardless of the findings. So this is a major shift that's occurring across different areas of the sciences. Still very low uptake though. So I've been working hard on trying to get more journals to use register reports. At first glance, this might not seem totally related to open access, but it is, because it's all about refocusing how we evaluate manuscripts for publication. And in doing so, it very much challenges the traditional for-profit publication enterprise and what publishers are trying to get out of our papers and how they publicize them and so on. And so it very much is trying to remove a lot of the power around the nature of findings and put it into the quality of the science. Related to that, I'm part of an initiative called Peer Community In, PCI. If you're not familiar with that, it's a broad family of, they're not journals, it's really a reviewing service. So it's an effort to centralize manuscript review of preprints and to remove review from the journals. So the journals aren't providing review, but the community is providing review. And then the preprints are reviewed, and then essentially after some revision, they could be recommended, and then journals could decide that they want to then publish the paper, which at that point they have essentially done nothing. So it's really trying to highlight how little for-profit publishers actually do, and how the scientific community can take control of that process. And I can say more about that. And then finally, very briefly, I'm highly involved in promoting the use of preprints and creating a strong preprint culture. I was a moderator for SciArchive, which is the preprint server specifically for psychology, which has become quite popular and very high levels of use, and co-authored an article on how to use preprints and why you should use them, and generally just trying to advocate for them by posting them. All my work I post as preprints, sharing them widely, encouraging others to do so, just to really to take some of that power away from the for-profit publishers. So I'll say more about all those kinds of things, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Moyne, very much. So we have some prepared questions, but let me back up and say thanks to each of you for your opening remarks, and to let our participants understand we've got a couple of questions, but as we are talking, I invite you to contribute additional questions, comments, or ideas. Our moderators in the background will be collecting all the questions and comments, and I will do my best to incorporate them into the conversation as we go. We have a lot of people here on the Social Sciences and Sciences panel today, so you may not hear your question read out word for word, but please be assured we're carefully recording and saving every one of them. And the purpose of our discussion today is to bring together our campus communities, our libraries, and faculty, and join ideas from every person about how we can collectively advance open publishing and open scholarship across the Big Ten. It's a complex topic. We know that from many years of talking about it. And there are many rich perspectives and many viable and practical approaches for how to keep advancing along this path. We will necessarily only be able to touch on a few of those today, but after the session, we'll open up an online discussion forum where you'll be able to add your ideas and build on the ideas of others. What is contributed today at this forum will help build a knowledge bank for community thinking and community conversation, which will become a part of our thinking and action in this space. This forum will be open over the next couple of weeks, and we invite and welcome your participation. I'll tell you more about how to do that, how to participate at the end of the session. So to start off our question for our panelists, what kind of impact is open access having in the publishing and research space? And what does this shift look like from traditional publishing to the open access model? Brian, would you like to start?
I'd be happy to. So I think one of the really important things that we've found with open access publishing is that by taking control of the back end of the publishing, and by working with our library of publishing partners, we have been able to make it take the part of editorial decisions that are related to kind of a predictive guess about the potential impact of the work, and we've been able to take that out of the equation. And this is really, I think, important and necessary, because the other publications that our society works to publish, we get far more submissions than we could ever publish in a year. And the editorial staff is always then asking the question, well, who's going to cite this? How many citations will it garner, et cetera? And what this does is it tends to favor work that is of a certain kind. And so maybe it's dealing more with the methodology behind the science rather than reporting results. Maybe it's work that is done at a scale that requires very large amounts of investment that's not accessible to everyone. And so what we found is that we've had authors from more diverse institutional backgrounds, from different types of academic institutions, and from different parts of the world that have been able to publish via this partnership. And that's been one really exciting aspect of it. We are, I guess, now really thinking about how we scale up. And the first year of our publication was done almost entirely using undergraduates as labor. So for things like copy editing and even the layout and production. And we've had really great help with the undergrads that have worked for the journal, but that doesn't sound sustainable to me. And as the person responsible, it makes me a little nervous. So we're now thinking about how do we take that next step and publish more than a dozen or so papers a year.
Thank you, Brian. Moyne, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thanks. I do think that open access has had a huge shift in the way we think about publishing, just massive, and especially around, as I already mentioned, around preprints. That's sort of an easy one for how it's changed things. Because not only have they become popular in psychology, as like all of you know, obviously it started heavily in physics and computer science with the archive, but then medRxiv and bioRxiv, but there's also now edRxiv for educational research and metaRxiv for meta science, and I think there are dozens of others, right? So there's these disciplinary specific preprint repositories, and what those have really highlighted and is what I already mentioned, just how little the for-profit publishers actually do as part of the process. And this isn't meant to be a bashing on publishers forum, but that's an integral part of this whole discussion is what role publishers play. And there's often this discussion about the added value provided by publishers, but it becomes very difficult to see when I know I can post a preprint on SciArchive and hundreds or thousands of people will see it. I'll get random people commenting, essentially providing peer reviews on it. I can even format the paper to look exactly like a published article. I can do the formatting, and I can do it also for papers that have been published in for-profit publications. I can create my own version that looks just like their version, that's perfectly legal and is green open access. So there's a lot of just questions about what exactly are we getting from the publishers and publication process. And so, there's a lot of discussions about that. And clearly, and something I'll come back to more later, there's the whole issue that's looming that Sylvie talked about, which is about journal prestige and journal impact factors and how we determine what journals are good and not good, and values that we assign based on those assumptions to individual articles. And I think open access has really just blown all of that up and really required us to reflect more deeply about what do we mean by quality research and quality articles and quality outlets. And that it's having an impact because the publishers care about this, right? They're encouraging preprint use, and they know that access is beneficial for the science, for them, honestly, because the distribution is so large, because they get cited heavily. As long as libraries and institutions are still paying subscription fees, what's the problem with it? So I think, I'm just focusing on preprints here. Some others might want to talk about other things, but I think it just completely changed the conversation. Has really opened up questions about what the value of traditional publishing even is.
I know we've had those questions and conversations here. I don't know, Sylvie, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I'll just add in quickly that the understanding the cost. I mean, when we made the decision to go with the private publisher after decades of self-publication, the selling point on doing that was that a big publishing house would market and expand our reach. And to me, that was a false, that was a red herring, I don't know what you call it, but it was not the reality of the world we were living in when people find it by using search engines that do not start with the title of the journal itself. And we found as our first 5-year contract has unfolded, we were unable to actually reduce our staff in publications. That's what we were supposed to gain, this reduction. And overall, our apparent costs, we are told, went up. And over again, I have been frustrated by not getting a good answer on what it actually costs to publish something. I'm not an economist, but I don't see the costs aligning with the bill we're paying.
Thank you, Sylvie. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that. Michael, we have a question for you. Could you talk a little bit about the OA funds offered in startup packages?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, this is actually pretty low-lying fruit as far as I'm concerned, right? This, as a department chair, I have whatever levers and strings I can pull to sort of encourage people to do what's consistent with our university values. And one of the things I started doing is I build in a small pot of money that is dedicated and exclusively dedicated to open access funding that is built into the startup fund. So it sits around $15,000, so it's not a lot. But for a new young faculty member who is trying to establish themselves and may not have access to grant funds, this could be an important stopgap to get them to the point where they have startup funds. And just to reiterate what other people have said, APCs is just one aspect or one small component of open access, and putting that in startup packages not only signals the importance of making our work open, but provide some funds for doing it. But, I think the bigger issue is really signaling so that when our young faculty come on there, they see that this is an important aspect of what we're asking them to do here in our department.
Thank you, Michael. And also thanks for your comment in the chat that went to everyone about learning about reforming departmental P&T policies to incorporate open science and scholarship, and your email. Thanks so much. Anyone have anything else to add to this question? We're doing great on time, by the way, so no worries there. All right, I'm going to move to our next question. Question number 2. Even today, many misconceptions about open access exist. For example, that Creative Commons licenses enable plagiarism, that OA publishing always requires an author payment, again, the APCs, or that open access models is synonymous with or rife with predatory publishing, which can convert into a lot of fears about rights, whether authors are giving up their rights, having their rights contorted or preyed upon, etc. So could you speak from your own experience in this arena and what you've perceived and what you would say to colleagues who are maybe a little skeptical or on the fence about OA because of these concerns? And I think, Michael, do you want to pick that one off?
Yeah, sure. I can kick this off. So first of all, in psychology, I think there's been a pretty rapid development of people's acceptance of open access over the last 5 or 6 years. I think in part led by the creation of the PsycArchives repository, which I think has helped, alleviate some people's concerns over it. I think more normalized making stuff public and open. So that's been really helpful. But you're right. The concerns about open access persist, and what's interesting is you could have conversation after conversation with individual, leave those conversations thinking people sort of get it, and then we see these issues sort of resurface. So just the whole open access sort of perception is that, well, if it's open access, it's going to cost money. Where is the money going to come from? And of course, once money's involved, then issues of equity and inequities start to arise. And I think the biggest challenge that we've had here is really conveying that open access doesn't mean publishing in an open access journal that's going to charge APCs. Again, leaving that as a possibility, but trying to communicate that really it's about making it work publicly accessible. And that's really where the value is making sure that people in the global South or elsewhere in the world, or even, at under-resourced institutions have access to our work. And that's really, I think as part of a state institution, this is our mandate. And quite frankly, as educators, this is our mandate. Issues about some of the nefarious actors in the space, I think are going to persist for a while. And, I think that just, it comes down to, just monitoring where you're publishing and what the journals are and stuff like that. But the issues of plagiarism, it's unclear to me whether publishing in open access or preprint servers really changes that, right? Because before it was the case that if you submitted an article for publication, people had access to it, reviewers did, right? And so you'd always worry about, well, you're going to be scooped by your reviewers. Now, of course, doesn't happen very often, but there's this perception, right, that it could happen. And the same thing is true if you're putting stuff out on preprint servers. Of course, the question there is, when you choose to put something on preprint servers, right? Is it before or after the publication and whatnot? But I actually think that in general, that making our work more open provides some protection to some of these things. Now, others may feel other ways, and I understand there's some fears, particularly amongst early career researchers, but my sense is that there's some layer of protection by virtue of making your work maximally public from the get-go, right? So I don't know if that covers everything or not, but I guess I can pass it on to the next person.
Great, thanks, Mike. Sylvie, thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I think the issue of your individual prestige is an enduring and tough nut. And so you can go round and round. What comes first, chicken or the egg? How do you change the P&T process? Well, the P&T process is us. And so, to say, well, we can't do that because of the P&T process. Well, that's like saying we can't do it because of us. Yet those arguments persist all the time. I think there is a lot of there's just a lot of lack of awareness of what makes something predatory versus what makes it a high prestige journal. And so one of the solutions that we're, kind of looking at and implementing slowly is you teach about it directly in your methods class. And so we've started a class here that's ostensibly on systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but we teach about how do you evaluate papers, how do you assess the quality, the bias, the need for, what does pre-registration of studies do? What should you be looking for? Why is it bad that all results don't get in, all well-done experiments don't get into the peer literature, what that means for, the file drawer problem, that kind of thing. So teaching about these issues for the next generation, especially as they are going to move into this next position where they feel highly insecure about how will their prestige be evaluated is really important. I can wait to add about the role of professional societies. I think that's a follow-on question. So I'll stop now on that.
Thanks, Sylvie. So, we're hearing about instruction, classroom instruction, how to do this from a department head perspective. What about a role that universities more broadly or professional organizations could play to help overcome some of the skepticism, some of the misconceptions, misperceptions? And I'll open it up to anyone.
I don't mind jumping in here once again, if you don't mind. So first, I just want to briefly touch on the reputational factor, because I think that's really crucial to the sort of perception of what promotion and tenure processes are perceived to be. But there's some real problems with relying on reputation, because reputation begets reputation begets reputation, right? And we get into that cycle where those who with the reputation are the ones that end up dominating everything. And the same is true of impact factors, and I think the issue there is that we have to recognize that there's very little relation between, the sort of journal prestige as defined by the impact factor and what we might call objective indices of quality of the research that goes into them, right? And we kind of owe it to our colleagues to actually evaluate the work, the substance of the work. you asked about what can departments do and what universities can do. And I think this is, consistent messaging really, really matters, and I like to, when I refer to, how we were able to do some of our reforms, it really comes down to the slow bleed of information, educating people consistently over time about what the historical approaches were, what those problems were, but why we could be doing something different and why we should be doing something different. And if you do that, I think people get the message. People want to do what's right. Faculty want to do what's right. Getting them past this, what will our colleagues say, or what will the provost say? I think those are the hurdles that faculty perceive, which oftentimes, quite frankly, aren't there. Because, if you ask faculty, most of them will say, well, I don't know why we use our journal impact factors. Like probably 65% of them would prefer not to. Right. So, I think there's a lot we could be doing differently, but I think a lot of it really comes down to consistent messaging by departments at all levels in the department.
Thank you, Mike. I saw some nods. Sylvie?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. This topic is one that I've certainly wrestled with a lot in my leadership role at the American Society of Agronomy, because we're only just beginning to make headway, but short tenures of leadership for professional societies is actually part of the problem. You come in, you try to make change, and if you have a permanent staff, they can just wait you out, and we know that's the case. I don't like the message, they wait you out. But I think, things that we have done to try to persuade is to simply demonstrate to people, if you publish open, you actually get higher citation rates. And that was just a quick analysis of our own green open journals, that if you were open, you got cited faster. And we had to do that for the board, to show the board, yeah, open is good. Another thing that I think has been really important, I would say in our department here, but then also with our professional societies, is having libraries, acquisition people tell the other side of the story. Most of us just forget about, or don't even think about, how that you click on the link to that journal article you're looking for and it magically downloads to your desktop. How does that come? And so we have had Beth's team speak to our professional boards on libraries' perspective on open and on subscription fees and things like that. And we've had them come speak in our department about what open is and what are the programs there to help facilitate it and what they should look for when they publish, not just, oh, I like this journal. What else should you look for?
Thank you, Sylvie. Moyne or Brian?
Yeah, I had two comments to make to follow up on what Michael and Sylvie said. One is I want to state a stronger version of one of Michael's statements about journal impact factors, which is that, to my knowledge, and I follow this literature pretty closely, and Michael has contributed to it, the empirical literature on impact factors. To my knowledge, there's not a single study that shows a positive indicator between journal impact factor and a quality rating of journals. All the empirical data either show no relation or a negative relation between journal impact and quality. That's been a consistent recurring finding that we see again and again and again. And despite the fact that that's the empirical knowledge base, it's still incredibly difficult to change people's minds about these things. I am in a very progressive department, I'd say, in terms of open science and open access and evaluating evidence and all those kinds of things. And I've sent some data to people, the powers that be in my department, and they say, oh yeah, well, we still know that these journals are the top ones in our field for X, Y, and Z reasons, basically what Michael said in terms of reputation, right? And that's what we use. We use reputation, how we're socialized, and journal impact factor to determine what journals are high quality. And both of those are really poor indicators. And yet our major argument against publishing in open access journals is concerns about quality, right? So it's all kind of a jumbled mess there. I think one of the things that we need to do is those of us who know better and who are in more senior and secure positions is need to be publishing in open access journals as much as possible, put our highest quality work there, right? Versus the traditional for-profit journals. The other thing I want to say about professional societies, and I know that they vary quite a lot in terms of their approach, but in my experience working with different professional societies, they've been a huge barrier to open access for two reasons. One is that professional societies tend to be conservative in terms of their approach to any kind of change, right? It just kind of gets committed to death in the publications committee and the executive committee. Any reform you're trying to make is very difficult to pass. The other is, of course, that professional societies tend to make a fortune off for-profit publishing. And they're very quick to justify why those fortunes should be made and how they put the money to good use and things of that nature. Although there's societies that I'm involved with that, I can look up on LexisNexis how much money they have in their tax returns and everything, and their millions just keep piling up, right? And meanwhile, they tend to squash any open access initiatives. So I think societies have a conflict of interest really around this, given that their massive financial benefit. Now, I know that varies a lot. I'm sure Brian has some things to say about this. It varies a lot by society, but that's been my experience with societies.
Thanks, Moyne. Brian, do you want to wrap us up on this question?
Yeah, I'd like to push back a little bit on that. So Moyne's thesis, I think, is that professional societies are benefiting from the existing publishing and maybe a barrier to the open access. At least in my society, we have been driving both open with our publications through our commercial publishers and through our new publication, but also in the field in general. And I guess it's obviously going to vary from one society to another, but we recognize that the reason our journals have high impact factors is because our reviewers and our editors do an amazing job. And we also know that the non-society published journals in our discipline, the best papers they publish each year are papers that go through peer review at our journals, are rejected, and then end up being published in these places. And so I think professional societies have a very big role to play. And until we figure out how to incentivize societies to sort of be able to fully take advantage of the open access, we're going to have a big conflict with people who want to publish everything in science open, but also the people who do the work in the societies who know that the revenue we generate through non-open publishing is critical to the development of our discipline. So for example, our society funds over $100,000 in scholarships to graduate students every year via revenues that we get from publishing non-open journals via partnerships with commercial publishers. It's really easy to sit here and say, oh, this is a horrible thing, we shouldn't be taking these revenues. But try telling that to the 40 or 50 students every year whose dissertation projects absolutely depend on this money, right? And for the health of our society and the growth of the society, unless we have a way to replace those funds, and let's remember, NSF doesn't have funding for graduate students anymore. There's all funds that were there 20 years ago when I was in grad school that aren't there anymore. I don't think we're ever going to be able to fully move to open publishing.
Well, thank you. Brian, you're just led us nicely into the next question, which is around barriers and challenges. So we're going to take a few minutes on this question. Let me read it. What are the barriers or challenges in the open science space that you're seeing on your campus or in your discipline? How do you think this translates to the broader publishing space in the academy? How do you bring those down, and how do we make it as easy as possible to do so? Moyne, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I'm just going to respond to Brian real quick, because we have some difference of opinion on this, which is great. I think that's a similar argument I've heard before, and I totally get it. Societies put the money that they get from traditional publishing to good use, but the counterfactual that's often presented is there would be no money. So it's either the money via traditional publishing or nothing, but that money itself comes from somewhere, right? It's largely coming from the universities themselves, filtered to the for-profit or sent to the for-profit publishers and then filtered down to the societies and then back to the students. But there could be an alternative model where the money, we don't do any of that loop and it goes directly from the universities to their students. There, that's major structural change, but there are alternatives to the current system that could still support students, I think. Okay, in terms of, I think we've really been talking about this a lot already, I think. So I try not to be redundant. I mean, there's the obvious challenges that Michael and others have discussed, which is, APCs and the costs associated with that under-resourced nations, institutions, scholars often don't have access to those kind of funds. And even those who are resourced, I'm at the University of Minnesota, one of the most well-funded and well-resourced institutions around. And I don't have a huge pot of money available for article processing charges. I need to come up with that and figure out where to find that money to be able to publish open access. It's not easy, right? And then you have journals like Nature charging $11,000 APC to publish in a journal. I mean, that is just absurd. The fact that we all just accept that and pretend like it's normal, which I know there's been a lot of backlash, and I don't even know where that currently stands, if they're actually doing that in practice. But that is just an absurd amount of money, and we shouldn't allow that to happen as far as I'm concerned, right? But the larger issue really is that of prestige that we keep coming back to, the pernicious impacts of prestige. Nature can charge $11,000 APC because it's Nature, and people need to publish in Nature to get to advance and have success in their field or in some areas. And so any discussion about open access really must center this discussion of prestige, which is why we've been having the discussion, I think, quite a bit, because you can't separate out the two. The fact that we have this system, this reward system in place that values certain types of outlets and devalues other outlets that's really the core issue as far as I'm concerned. Everything else can fall from, if we can work through what it means for a quality publication or a quality outlet, that will solve many of our other problems. And as Sylvie said, I think, she hit it right on the head. We always act as though it's some external forces that are making us succumb to this reward system, right? We're the ones who create it. We are in charge of it. We are the ones who develop the system. We are the promotion and tenure committee, right? We are the external evaluators of those who are going up for promotion. And so we have to actually have the will and the desire to actually make some change. But I often say it's rare in many systems in society where the participants in the system have direct access to the power base of the system. But in the academic setting, it's actually a very narrow space because of self-governance, because we control ourselves in many ways. Of course, the administration-esque, whatever you want, proliferation has changed that a little bit. But generally speaking, there's a close access to power. So we actually can make some change relatively easily compared to some other systems. This has all been said before. I think I wanted to highlight one other related issue, which is especially pertaining to scholars from marginalized backgrounds, especially in the social sciences, where they're often doing work with marginalized populations. So bringing it to psychology for a second, there's definitely some concern around kind of changing the rules now that scholars who are doing that kind of work are actually having success. So just as they're able to start publishing work with marginalized communities in the top journals, which years ago was really not possible, it almost didn't happen at all, it was getting gatekeeped out. Just as they're starting to be able to do that and realize success as it has been defined for so long, now people are coming and saying, well, those journals aren't any good anyway, right? So I always say PNAS, PNAS is not a good journal. And people get really upset with me about that because they've been working for a long time to get their work published in that journal. And they do. And then here I come along saying, well, it's not a good journal anyway. So this is a complicated issue around sort of who's on the leading edge of these reforms and then who pays the price, right? And I think that's why there's been a lot of discussions, especially in psychology, but in other areas too, around whether open science in general, open access is truly an equitable, democratic movement, or if it's just another kind of reproduction of elite processes. And I've been blabbing, so I'll stop and
Thank
open it
you.
up for someone else.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly in the Big Ten, the library deans and directors have been talking about that very issue about elitism, and that's part of our just part of this. Michael, Brian, Sylvie?
I'll just briefly weigh in. I don't echo almost everything that Wayne said. And I'll say that, one of the things that we've, I think, been successful at doing here in my department is getting rid of impact factors as part of our criteria. In fact, we explicitly state that that those sorts of prestige reputation metrics have no place in the evaluation. Now, people will do what they're going to do, right? We have our criteria, and surely somewhere implicitly, maybe even explicitly, reviewers are going to take that into account. But we've explicitly in our criteria have eliminated those as part of our process. And part of that was because we wanted to ensure that people had freedom of choice where they wanted to publish their research. If you're doing community engaged work that's targeting a particular subpopulation, and the most appropriate journal where your audience is going to be, you should be empowered to publish in those outlets. And we wanted to make sure that aspect of the research system was recognized, and that people felt like they could do the work the way they needed to do the work and publish in the venues that they needed to publish in to reach their community. And so we've sort of, as part of those broader reforms, we have asked, explicit value statements about community engaged work. And we have lengthy discussions about why it's important to sort of build into our criteria the ability for people to make those sorts of decisions. And what's really interesting is that faculty have subsequently come to me, not all of them, but a small number, who have said, I really want to publish in open access journals, and I'm so glad that I feel like I can now. Because they are a little worried about sort of the ethics of publishing in for-profit journals. And I think to be honest, I think it's become a bit of a recruitment tool for new young faculty to see that we have these progressive policies in place, and they aren't going to be held to publishing in a subpar journal like PNAS. I'll just, one of the things I'll echo. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that and then let Sylvie or Brian.
Brian, thoughts?
I'll pass.
Okay, Sylvie.
I don't want to be redundant, but I think it does get back to somewhere we've lost track. I mean, it's not going to be free. And so someplace we've lost track of being able to price this out, to budget it, whether it's from the society, whether it's from the researcher putting in costs, whether it's from the university trying to decide how big Beth's budget should be. We've lost track of what does this thing actually cost. I can equip my lab to a budget better than I can figure out what I'm going to be doing with paying for the various fees with respect to who wants to publish where. And so from that side of things, I really do think it's important to figure it out. Yeah, societies are definitely my experience, they are change adverse, especially if they have a fairly large permanent staff. Just like any department is averse to change. So that's part of it. And you get people coming in just for flashing in saying you should change this, and then they leave. And so there's a lack of consistency of agenda. But we do programs, whether they're run by departments, whether they're run by, a professional society, things cost money. And this just remains this sort of black hole. Yeah, I mean, the society runs on meetings, pubs, and membership fees. And it's a nonprofit. How much money should they have in the kitty? That's another question that needs to be addressed among professional societies. Do you need to sit on a huge goose egg, or is a little hen egg sufficient in terms of your resources as a professional society?
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to turn now to our audience for some questions. I'm in the Q&A, and I'd like to start with a question that, let's see, oops, answered. Michael did pose an answer to it, but I'd like to get input from the rest of you. Can the faculty panel speak to whether the Nelson OSTP memo will change or impact tenure and promotion practices at their institution? That's the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. And Michael commented on Helios. Purdue is a Helios participant. I think some of my colleagues in the Big Ten are as well. But thoughts on this new memo and tenure and promotion practices?
Yeah, I can just sort of briefly touch on some of the conversations around this. So in the Helios space and the National Academy space, which has a sort of the initiating organization for that Helios project, a lot of the discussion has been on sort of the memo as sort of serving as yet another bit of motivation for transforming tenure and promotion. It is, when I've listened to the government officials talk about the OSTP memo, they recognize that the incentive structures need to change too. So they're really looking at this, I think, from the broad perspective of societies, the professional societies, the funders, and from the perspective of institutions and promotion of tenure. I mean, my perspective on this, obviously, we need to reform tenure and promotion anyway. The Nelson memo, I think, with the requirements of making work open with federally funded work, I think could potentially lead to, two sets of standards for those who are funded versus those who are not. So I think really thinking about what's the implication for maybe even in creating sort of differential guidelines should motivate people to sort of step back and think, hey, we need to think about the incentives in light of the OSTP memo.
Thank you, Michael. Other thoughts on this? Questions are coming in. Oh, Sylvie?
So just off the top of my head, and Beth, you can disagree with me if you have a different perception, but I think if you surveyed most senior faculty here on campus, they would not know what you were talking about. So in the near term, I don't expect it will have any impact until that, awareness of, first there has to be awareness. Then there has to be some thought around it that's just not like, oh yeah, okay, well, maybe we'll think about that. And then there has to be the desire to actively think of how you're going to apply the intent, to realize the intent of that memo in your own particular little P&T culture.
Yeah. Thank you, Sylvie. Here at Purdue, we have formed a working group with a couple of faculty members, librarians, IT professionals, and research office people to actually really explore the NIH aspect of it, since that's the more urgent one. But yes, absolutely, awareness would be something that we have to be working on. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. They're coming in fast and furious. Curious if those of you with roles in societies have awareness of or have considered alternative models such as subscribe to open, models that keep up revenue to cover costs of publishing but do not charge authors and do not charge readers. Any experience with subscribe to open? Okay, that question is part of our record. We'll have to keep it for moving forward. Next one, we've been talking a lot about journal publishing. What does the landscape for faculty publishing ebooks look like? There are more ebook packages, Knowledge Unlatched, libraries are purchasing, but are faculty using these resources in the classroom? Maybe this question's out of scope, but are there any quick answers to this one? Faculty and ebooks, are you using the packages we subscribe to in your teaching? All right, another good question.
I guess I can briefly say, we're not really talking that much about OER, but certainly the broad category of OER we're using heavily. Whether we're using ebook packages, I think it's hard to say. I can say that I'm not, but I know in our department that I think it's over 60% of our undergraduate courses are completely open access now in terms of their materials.
Great. OER is a big topic, perhaps for
Yeah.
another.
Sorry, okay, but I will say that in terms of OER, I mean, the grad class that we're teaching, we try to only use open resources. And it's a graduate class, so that's different, but if something is there, but it's useful, but not open, we do not rely on it for the meat of this methods class, because it just seems, to stick with the theme of the importance of open. That's a philosophical decision of it's co-taught of the instructor team.
Okay, next one. There are emerging diamond OA journals like Seismica. I might not be saying that right. Has there been any research to analyze successful high quality OA titles to learn about cost? Moyne, did I see a nod? No.
Oh, yeah, I don't know of any research on it. I mean, the Diamond Open Access journals that I have experience with are all funded in different ways, right? There are many different funding models. Sometimes it's a particular university is funding the journal. Sometimes it's there's one called Personality Science that's relatively new in psychology, that's being funded by German Psychological Society, as well as several other different societies focused on personality. So they all kind of contribute a little bit. The funding models are so varied, but I haven't seen any research or even any summary document about how they're being funded.
Okay.
Michael might know that better. I don't know.
No. Okay. Let's see. Oh, lots of votes for this one. Can the panel speak to policy changes at your institutions that facilitate or mandate approaches to OA? I know that Michael can speak to you in Maryland's equitable access policy, but would be interested to hear about other efforts across the Big Ten. Policy changes at your institutions that facilitate or mandate approaches to OA. Opening it up.
I'll just briefly comment on the University of Maryland's policy. So we adopted this policy, I want to say about 6 months ago. It follows on what Harvard's model is, essentially mandates too strong of a word, but strongly encourages / requires faculty, any research published by faculty to be deposited in a university repository or other open access form. Does not require open access publishing models to be used necessarily, but does require that faculty are making their work publicly accessible through a preprint server or through the university's repository.
Thank you, Michael.
So, we have discussed whether there would be sufficient will right here at Purdue. This has been discussed in the University Library Committee a lot. We have occasionally gone to the Senate to sort of put something out there. But today we do not have a policy. I think, Beth, we're still talking about it, right? Should we do this? And, there's a little bit of a, how do you engage the Senate in thinking this is the right thing to do? We have done information sessions for the Senate. I think it's tended to have gotten lost in some of the other issues that we have dealt with related to faculty governance. And so it just hasn't stuck. Beth, you may have more to add to that.
Not really, Sylvie. It's a matter, again, of awareness, and we need to keep persisting, I think, we in the libraries, with your help. Okay, let's see. In the Q&A, there's information about subscribe to open. Let's see. Here's one. Sylvie noted that many faculty would not be familiar with some of the issues that we've been talking about today. That's for sure. Do you have any recommendations for successfully and broadly engaging faculty that would actually help to move the institutional needle on our approach to open scholarship and open science? Any recommendations? And I'll add that recommendations to the libraries on your campus or to the Big Ten.
Well, Beth, I think that having libraries come talk about open in faculty meetings at the department level is critical in getting this going. I mean, I can talk about it, but nobody's that interested. And when we bring in people to talk about open and to talk about the benefits of open that we've made more progress.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my general recommendation, this is in terms of open science practices in general, so not specifically open access, but it applies here too. But my general advice is show, don't tell, right? So you really need to give concrete data or what the concrete benefits are for individuals to care. Purely based on a sort of moral or even sort of good scientific practice kind of argument, those tend to not go very far because, of course, you know, everyone at my institution thinks they are the best scientists in the room. And so, you know, who is this other person to tell me? But if you can show some data or you can show some clear outputs or something concrete on the benefit, then that usually has more effort. And I think that's what Michael said, why one reason he was able to be successful in his department. Now, that said, I earlier told a story of not being particularly successful in showing data to some members of my department. So there's still resistance there. But in terms of open access, what I try to do sometimes if I'm sharing an article with a colleague in my university, I'll say, oh, and this was published in this great open access journal. And I sort of highlight the journal and say, look at this really great paper that was published in this journal that you might not know much about, and it's open access. So that's kind of more showing versus telling. So it just becomes part of the regular culture. I also make sure to include such journals in my graduate syllabus for my different courses, so that work is being assigned. You know, I'm not purposely choosing those articles. I mean, I'm choosing them because they're excellent articles, but I'm not saying, oh, I can only choose articles from traditional top tier publications, but rather try to highlight these other sources.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes left. There is one question I missed from earlier on. So everybody, if you could think about this. When we think of barriers, and we did touch on barriers, one important question is about open scholarship for diverse communities. What if we don't have money to do this? How will this be supported for faculty who don't have the resources? Thoughts on the just, scalable, trustworthy, sustainable, but really related to open scholarship for diverse communities?
Other than that, you have to think about it explicitly. I mean, from the professional society perspective, we know that we are self-limiting when our costs for everything are too high, and we need to figure out how to adjust those costs. And if we really want to be inclusive, and it is something that we are struggling with because it runs into the profit motivation, or I shouldn't say profit, but the dollar value motivation to support the society activities.
Thanks, Sylvie. Brian, you talked about scholarships for students. Is there something related to diverse communities related to that? Or is it more about access?
I mean, I guess I'll just echo Sylvie's point about, you know, there are costs involved with trying to affect change as a society. And so if your society values input from a bunch of diverse communities like ours does, it's nice to have operating funds to be able to support programs that facilitate those aims, right? And just to reiterate my point, I really do think that the financial part of this ends up being, at least from the standpoint of professional societies, the really tricky thing to solve. And, the biological sciences at least have hundreds of societies that are very focused and very small in numbers. And as I talk to people in these various societies, that topic comes up over and over and over and over again. So if you're a society for invertebrate paleontology, it's in your professional interest to do things like training students and publishing open access because you want to attract people to the discipline that you're working in. And not having none of us, even those of us who are working in open access publishing, really know exactly how best to calculate all the costs, the financial costs involved with doing so.
Great, thank you. Well,
Can I say a couple things or quickly? I'll
sure.
be fast. Okay. So in response to this question, one is that, remember, when we're talking about open access, that's a broad bouquet of different approaches, right? And green OA doesn't really cost anything but time, right? It's a cost-free approach to make your scholarship an awareness, I guess, of how to do so. But we shouldn't be careful to always equate open access with APCs. But then even there, for journals that do charge APCs, they have quite a lot of variation in terms of how they approach those. So some, especially for a lot of for-profit journals, are pretty rigid and won't often waive them unless they're from an institution that's on their list that already has some sort of different scale. But if you're an institution in the US and you don't have any money, you're pretty much out of luck usually. But there are other models for some journals. Collabora Psychology from the UC Press, which by the way is an outstanding journal and really a model for how to run a cost-based, APC-based open access journal. They have a sliding scale or a complete waiver if you don't have funds. So if you can demonstrate that you're unable to provide funds, they will publish the paper. And it's not a high fee. I think it's $8.50 or something to begin with, and they've been doing a great job. So I think those are a couple issues. The other is what the libraries fund for APCs. I think the University of Minnesota several years ago got rid of the fund largely because we're trying not to push the money onto the individual researchers and trying to do more negotiations with publishers. But that's something that the libraries could do if they have a need-based fund, like a truly need-based fund. I think we had a need-based fund before, but it was pretty easy to say you needed when you didn't really need, right? So something like that, or that prioritizes work being done with marginalized groups, or something like that, I think could be helpful.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at the point where I should start to close us. Thank you, panelists, for excellent conversations, for the links you put into the chat and in the Q&A. In closing, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We hope that this session will inspire follow-up conversations in your libraries and on your campuses, and in the many peer groups and initiatives across the Big Ten Academic Alliance. Let's see, following this session, we will open up an online community conversation so that our conversation today can continue. It's in wind tunneling based on these same questions. All of you are invited to join in the discussion there, see what others are saying, and add your thoughts and your ideas. You will receive a follow-up email from the session today with instructions on how to join Wind Tunnel, and we'll also post this information on the Big Ten Academic Alliance website. Please feel free to share this information with your colleagues if they would like to join the conversation as well. The ideas contributed to this forum will help build a knowledge bank for community thinking and community conversation, which will become part of our thinking and action in this space. This forum will be open over the next couple of weeks, and we invite and welcome your participation. Everyone, our next big convening session will be on March 13th, 10 Central, 11 Eastern. Please plan to join us for an exciting session where we'll take a closer look at the current progress and what's coming as we bring the concept of the big collection down off the whiteboard and take a closer look at what we're building. We'll be in touch with further details as the date approaches. When you leave the Zoom, you'll get a brief survey about your experience of the session today. Please take a moment to fill this out. We appreciate your input as we plan and strengthen future sessions. Thank you again to our panelists. We're grateful for your participation. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next time.